Estimates suggest there are somewhere between 7 and 10 million different species currently on planet Earth. All of these will have arisen from one single ancestral species, and the process of speciation is absolutely key in understanding this. In this video, what we'll do is explore the types and processes of speciation and explain the key factors that affect how speciation occurs and the rate at which it can happen. Firstly, let's have a look at what speciation actually is. Speciation is the process by which new species are formed. It always starts with one species, so one species has to be essentially split into two groups. When these groups of species are split into two distinct groups, gene flow must cease between them. Now, gene flow tends to take place through sexual reproduction in most animals. Asexual reproduction doesn't generally count in this particular case because that's just a form of natural cloning, but some bacteria are able to exchange gene information through various different forms. But what we're really interested in here is sexual reproduction. If we can prevent sexual reproduction, then two groups of species are able to form in this particular case. Isolation or separation can really occur in many different ways, but the simplest form is geographic isolation, and this is where two groups of organisms are separated in terms of where they are, their place. This could be a physical barrier. For example, a canyon may form over time, a mountain range can rise up and separate groups of organisms, or an ocean or a river can form. If this happens, the individuals from each group are placed into different niches. They may have to change their behavior, their feeding patterns, and this in turn over time can lead to speciation. We can see this in this image here. So organisms moving into a new area, they need to change their feeding behaviors, and therefore this can lead to changes in their physiology. It also changes their role in the ecosystem if they need to perhaps go from being a primary consumer to perhaps changing into a secondary consumer. And this different niche and different pressures changes the way that the species kind of exists as such. Okay, so that is speciation as a process. What we need to think about then is reproduction. Reproduction is key to the process of speciation. Now, in the natural world, success is measured by an organism's ability to reproduce and pass on its genes. We essentially know this as survival of the fittest, coined by this man here, Charles Darwin. He said that essentially the fittest survive and they pass on their genes through having beneficial traits. So if you have beneficial traits, it means that you're able to run away from predators or hide from predators or reach more food. And because of that, you're able to survive and you're able to pass on your genes. It means that you're stronger. In order to survive, organisms have to adapt. They have to change. This happens very quickly in terms of behavior. Behavior can change in a single generation in the form of feeding or mating habits. And essentially can be seen again in this image here. So all of these individuals at some point will have changed their feeding behavior in order to become what they are today. Now, what we can see is that behavior change in terms of feeding then in turn leads to physiological change over a longer period of time. So this is where changes occur in the structure of the body. Now, this is much more lengthy in terms of its process because physiology is determined by genes. So we need those genes to be passed on over generation after generation. We don't just suddenly change the shape of our beak or grow a longer neck in the case of something like a giraffe. This has to happen very gradually over time. Reproductive isolation can occur in a number of different ways. So the first is timing, so temporal. Organisms reproduce at different times of the year or day. So you may find a nocturnal behavior will change the way that a group of organisms behaves. They might find more food available at night in the form of maybe insects or moths, and therefore they don't come into contact with another group of organisms. Therefore they're isolated, and therefore they can start to change genetically, and those physiological changes can happen over time. Behaviorally, these occur when species develop different courtship behaviors. So birds are another good example of this because they use songs and mating calls to communicate with individuals of the same species. And they will ignore mating calls of other species. There are lots of different examples of behavioural changes that you can see. Some organisms have developed dancing, courtship patterns, some others perhaps build nests, etc., and these kind of things. And I'll give you some examples to look at towards the end of the video. Mechanically, physical changes in genitalia generally applies a lot in insects. So physical differences prevent copulation from happening, or in some cases pollination in plants. It stops it from happening in that particular case, so they just cannot reproduce mechanically. And then ecological isolation. This is where individuals have the same ecosystem, but they occupy different habitats within it. So if you think back to the niches lesson, where we looked at where some birds fed at the bottom of a forest, whereas some fed at the top, they never come into contact with each other. They never need to reproduce. And that's a form of isolation. And that can occur within the same ecosystem. So we do not have to have that physical barrier, in the way. Okay, so reproduction is key, but there are many other factors that can influence speciation as a process. These are included here. So we have things like movement of continents, as we said, physical barriers. Climate change is becoming a well talked about concept. Climate change can impact the energy and food availability because of the amount of sunlight that an area receives. Rainfall and water availability can change due to climate. And this can lead to organisms looking for new niches or migration. And this can actually lead to invasion of new species, and it can lead to changes in niche behaviours because of competition. Population size is key. Larger populations tend to see the appearance of more mutations, so mutations in the genes. Sometimes these mutations can be beneficial, and if they're beneficial, then it's possible that speciation could occur more frequently. Habitat diversity is important. This increases the number and the variety of niches that are available and the different roles that an organism can play in an ecosystem. Life history, also key. Faster life cycles increases the rate of mutation. So we tend to find this in less complex organisms, perhaps insects, for example, where faster life cycles increases that rate of mutation and the rate of change physiologically. Change in food source is important. That's where we talked about the idea of birds perhaps feeding at the top or the bottom of a forest, and therefore spending more time in those areas and therefore not coming into contact with other individuals. And the changing colour of habitat, there are some really fine examples of where habitat changes in terms of its colour, and this can cause the loss of maybe snow or maybe the coloration change of trees. And it puts different pressures on species in terms of their ability to camouflage and to hide from prey or to hide from predators, etc. And this in turn puts more pressure on groups, and it can cause changes in the population. These are a good set of examples. So what I would do at this point is maybe pause the video, take a note of some of these. If you're interested in speciation in more depth, we're only touching on it briefly here. Take note of these case studies and have a look at how speciation has occurred here in each of these examples. This will give you a much wider depth of knowledge about how speciation occurs and the factors that influence it. So, as a summary, speciation is the process by which new species form. Only the fittest individuals survive and pass on their genes. When groups of individuals from the same species are isolated, new species may form. Reproductive isolation is absolutely key to the new species formation, and other factors can influence the rate of speciation. Now that you've watched this video, you can have a go at the next quiz. Good luck.